Meckler, the president of the Convention of States. Very interesting to see, Mark, that Amazon now attacking with one of its documentaries this very idea of coming together to make our constitutional republic an even better place to live.
Yeah, it was kind of a shocking thing to find out about last week. I had no idea this was going on. They certainly didn't approach anybody from our organization. But I was actually told by somebody in the White House that this existed. They pointed me to the clip. And for some reason, they've decided this is the great threat to our Constitution. They're actually attempting to use constitutional process.
Now, why is it so important to not only call for a convention like this, but our federalist system in the constitutional apparatus of our great country? In other words, states' rights and the fact that we have laboratories of democracy, 50 states, 6 territories, so that the federal government can look and say, oh, wow, that's actually a great idea. And you can point to several examples of this in our nearly 250-year history.
Yeah, look, this clause in Article 5 was put in there during the convention in 1787 because the states understood that eventually the federal government would become tyrannical and try to override the people's will. And they wanted the states to have the opportunity to rise up peacefully, actually, just by calling a convention, gathering, and proposing amendments to restrain federal tyranny. And I think that what's going on, why we're seeing this make its way into the mainstream culture through this Amazon Prime documentary, is that the left, the radical left, is afraid of this. They are inherently statists. They don't like the idea of federalism. They want to be able to control everything from the top down. So the idea of dispersing power around the country to all 50 states is something they're inherently opposed to.
And why do you think that is? Is it because of this globalist uniparty movement? Is it simply a structure of control? Is it making money? Or is it a refusal just simply not to look on the other side, even if there is, a valid point of disagreement?
Yeah, I actually think it's all of the above. I mean, everything you described is part of this system now where the federal government has grown beyond its constitutional boundaries. The framers knew this would happen. And the reason they knew it would happen is it's not that they had a crystal ball. They understood human nature. This is what human beings do. They conglomerate power to themselves. When they get power, they want more power. That's just human nature, like I said. And so they provided this relief mechanism to blow us out of a situation like this. And I do believe that there are globalists involved that don't want this to happen. People like the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce wouldn't want this to happen. Any big organizations that derive their power from lobbying in Washington, D.C., it becomes more difficult for them if the power is dispersed to the state legislatures.
And they call it shiny, happy people. It's almost as if they're talking down to us.
Yeah. Look, and the reason for that title, this is a documentary show, apparently. I just found this out in the last week. I was unfamiliar. It's their #1 documentary show. It started last year. Their first season was an expose on a Christian family by the name of the Duggar family. And there were some very serious allegations and charges, I think even convictions of child abuse in that family. And so this family was elevated by Amazon in order to attack Christians. This is the main purpose of the show, as far as I can tell, to paint with a broad brush anybody who does anything bad. The second season has nothing to do with the Duggar family. It's about a Christian camp back in the 90s, a teen camp, part of the Christian evangelical movement that they're attacking. I'm unfamiliar with the camp or the movement. And the odd part is that they just kind of plop Convention of States down in the middle of this. We have nothing to do with this teen camp. Convention of States didn't exist in the 90s, but they just sort of throw this out gratuitously in a 3-minute segment attacking Convention of States.
And tell us more about the Convention of States for viewers who might not be familiar with it. What are some of the goals, and ultimately, what are you seeking to do as the president of the organization to bring that sound Bill of Rights, common sense, and the framers' vision into 2025?
So Article 5 of the Constitution contains the ways in which we're allowed to amend our Constitution. One way is when Congress proposes an amendment. Takes 2/3 of both houses, and that's how we've gotten all of our amendments. The second way is when the states decide to gather in convention. It takes 2/3 of the states, or 34 states, to call for that convention. So far, 19 have done so. When we reach that 34 state threshold, the states will gather, and what they'll discuss is amendments that would control the federal government fiscally. In other words, impose potentially a balanced budget amendment, tax caps, spending caps, things like that. Second would be anything that would impose term limits, not just on Congress, but it could be on the bureaucrats and the staffers in the DC, what we now know as the deep state. And third is anything that would take and limit the scope, power, or jurisdiction of the federal government, return that scope, power, and jurisdiction to the people in the states. So these are things that the vast majority of Americans support. They're very common sense. They're not partisan. They would return an equal amount of power to any state, whether you're talking about New York or Texas. So this is something that all Americans should support.
Now, is there any fear if this convention would be called and then big government items would get into it? So say that some of the delegates there might look at Washington, D.C. and say, oh, it's not centralized enough. Let's even grow it some more. Is there a possibility of that happening?
I think there is fear, and that fear has been imposed by the radical left in America. Over 250 leftist groups from Planned Parenthood to La Raza and MoveOn.org have signed a press release against what we're doing. But the reality is, by the terms of the convention itself and the applications made by the state, the only things they can talk about are things that limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints, or impose term limits on Washington, D.C. So it is a very limited agenda that could be discussed at the convention.
And how is there a way to counter this Amazon documentary? Is it something that could be produced by, say, a right of center organization, or maybe something at the Convention of States to actually showcase, if that does call into convention at the time, what's actually happening there, and that it has nothing to do with, this Christian camp that may have been left, right, or center back in the 90s, well before this movement was organized?
Yeah, I think it's very hard for folks on the right to strike at the heart of mainstream culture. And really, honestly, we don't feel a need to counter this. Actually, I think this was excellent for our organization. It brought attention to the idea of a convention of states to mainstream, what I would describe as Hollywood left America, people who might not know about this at all. So we're pretty happy with it. The folks who support convention of states found a lot of humor in it and actually really enjoyed it.
It's a really good point, Mark, because it reminds me of the Book of Mormon, the musical. It's produced by the South Park creators. And I noticed going to see that show that the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, put together ads and said, if you have questions, come see us. It was a brilliant, masterful marketing that took place. And in many times, it's almost name ID for the other side or someone you're trying to humiliate or put down. And in the process, well, why not come see what we're all about? And then in return, Americans become curious about this rather extraordinary movement.
Yeah, and I think this is really important for folks on the right to understand that the left has lost a large part of its cultural sway. And when they attack us, one of the things that it does is it shows us that we're definitely over the target. So for our 5 million plus folks out there across the country, for people that were watching on social media who are conservatives, they're looking at this and thinking, well, if the left is attacking this, maybe it's something I ought to take a look at.
And you have some very big endorsements coming from the vice president, the House Speaker, and some others who are looking to maybe get this going and actually have, again, power returning back to the states as it was originally intended.
Yeah, we've been incredibly blessed over the years. I mean, in this administration, as you said, we have J.D. Vance, we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins, Mike Huckabee, who is now the ambassador to Israel, Caroline Leavitt, I think the best press secretary in modern history. All of these folks came into the administration already supporting Convention of States. So we have a very broad and deep bench of Convention of States supporters that are well known to the American public.
So as you try to reach that 34 state threshold, first, can you share how that might happen, the process of getting to that point, but also, do you believe that maybe getting some of these agencies out into America away from K Street can kind of break up the lobbying firms in order for these cabinet secretaries, which many of them, it's impressive because not only subject matter experts in bringing common sense back to government, but they've been governors, they've been in media, they know the departments they're dealing with, so they're bringing that Main Street to K Street. But would it not be nice to see, say, the Department of Agriculture in somewhere like South Dakota or Texas and start getting these agencies out into what I like to call real America?
Yeah, I really appreciate that effort being taken by the Trump administration. I know the USDA just laid off a bunch of people and they're going to move a bunch of their offices out around the country. I know that's been done during the first Trump administration with the Department of the Interior. And I think that is a very healthy thing for the United States of America. The people who make these decisions should be living in the areas that are most affected by these decisions. But this is a really important caveat to all of that. I'm afraid that post-Trump administration, if we have another leftist administration, which our politics swing back and forth, eventually we will, that they'll just reconsolidate those agencies in Washington, D.C., and they'll grow them more than ever before. And this is one of the reasons I think calling a convention of states is so necessary. I'll give you a specific example. President Trump has talked about doing away with the Department of Education. I know he and the secretary are working very hard to do that. Even if they get it done, the next time there's a Democrat administration, they'll just re-up that Department of Education. We want to make that permanently constitutionally impossible. The Constitution should have language in it that prohibits the federal government from being involved in our education system in any way. And if we do that, that's how you put the lid on this forever.
We know that President Reagan stated that before, as it was his goal post-Carter administration, and something that they could not achieve, that the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. And countless things that were supposed to be temporary, gosh, really since 1913, this modern progressive movement and the implementation of the federal income tax, leading to Social Security and other so-called safety nets that have now been a big doom and gloom umbrella over our constitutional foundation. And now I find this very interesting as well, Mark. Most of the states, have they not somewhat adopted either term limits, a balanced budget amendment? Many of these legislators have to go there for a short period of time and actually produce a balanced budget. And you have those amendments in state constitutions. So it seems as if these laboratories of democracy, they end up getting it right, while our federal government, now $36 trillion in debt and counting, with the average American owing nearly $110,000 per the debt, and that includes people under 18.
Yeah, the vast majority of states have figured out a lot of this stuff. And there are simple things, and we're talking about the big things like a balanced budget amendment or term limits. There are very simple things that are supported by the American people. For example, most states have something either constitutionally or by statute called a single subject amendment or a single subject rule that says you can't have these 2,000-page bills. They have single subject bills that are put out there for an up or down vote. That's the way our federal government should operate, and we could pass a single subject amendment. Another one is our Supreme Court. People are nervous about the idea of packing the Supreme Court. The left has said they will absolutely do this if they take power again. They will do away with the filibuster. They'll pack the Supreme Court. Well, we could, I think, easily pass an amendment to limit the Supreme Court to 9. Another subject that's pretty hot right now is the idea of anchor babies under the 14th Amendment. Clearly, the 14th Amendment was not meant to allow people to just come in, have a baby, and that baby is automatically a citizen. And we can clarify that through an amendment, which would be supported by the vast majority of Americans.
So interesting to dive deep into these issues. I'm curious as well, Mark, with your background, not only in the Convention of States and also the Tea Party Patriots, what are your thoughts on the One Big Beautiful Bill? Because we saw a lot of good there. There were some concerns about how large it was, but now you start seeing rescissions happening, and specifically with the $9 billion regarding PBS, NPR, and public funding of truly state media. And when I grew up, it was Sesame Street teaching you the basics, the ABCs, the golden rule, how to treat one another. Now it's transgender story hour. How's your approach to, or your grade more or less, regarding Republicans' approach to legislation in this golden era?
Yeah, if I were to give it a grade, I'd give it a solid B, and especially for effort. Look, I just don't think they could have gotten anything else done in this era of such a slim majority. I just think it's very difficult, and people have to understand threading the needle in the way that Speaker Johnson did and Leader Thune, I think, is really incredible. I'm a big supporter of especially Mike Johnson. I think he's the most conservative speaker to hold the gavel in my lifetime, but they can only do so much. I don't think bills can be big and beautiful, so I think this one was big and not so beautiful, but I also think the best we could expect under the circumstances. I also want to say, I think this is the best reason we need a convention of states. When you look, we have control over all three branches of government, alleged conservatives, and this is the best we can get. This is why the people need to intervene.
Mark Meckler, the president of Convention of States. Sir, where can people help support the effort, and what are you looking to achieve in the next or the rest of the year? Let's look to the end of it, and where can people help support this great cause?
Yeah, people can go to conventionofstates.com and get signed up to support the cause. They can follow me on X at Mark Meckler. And I expect that we're going to pass a couple more states by the end of the year. I'm looking forward to North Carolina and perhaps Ohio. Those are probably the two on my most up and coming target list.
Very exciting. And before we part, is it really a Republican or Democrat issue? What are you finding out there as you break bread with everyone wanting to bring constitutional common sense back to our great republic?
We've polled this nationally, and it's over 2/3 of people. It doesn't matter what state we're in. It doesn't matter what party we're talking about. When you explain to people what we're trying to do, they realize it's a nonpartisan effort, and they're engaged.
Please join us again on The Voice of Reason. Mark Meckler with the Convention of States. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Mark Meckler for joining us on The Voice of Reason. The Convention of States action, something that is endorsed by Vice President J.D. Vance and also Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, as well as countless state and local leaders. Time for our federal government to live under the authority of the Constitution, and now we are returning to those constitutional times and those breakdowns of what is proper in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. And God willing, we can bring down some of this $36 trillion of debt. That's roughly $110,000 of debt that each person owes because of the incompetence of the uniparty. It's people who are not able to vote yet, including minors in this country. $110,000 each, roughly. I'm sure that you can add that into your budget, right?